Previously on Warhawks of Mass Destruction.
Now, can you please get back to what you were saying about oil?
Yes. Once we control the oil, we control everything. Saddam will be toppled, just like that.
Why didn't you bring this up in the meeting?
That day, the spark for war had been lit. But first, back to Afghanistan. Remember when I said that the Taliban in Afghanistan have been accused of harboring bin Laden? Well, Bush did, so in an attempt to get revenge for 9/11, Bush gave the Taliban an ultimatum. On September 20th, 2001, Bush addressed the nation following the attacks. It was there that he introduced the American people to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. He gave the Taliban a warning: turn bin Laden over or be invaded.
Hand over every terrorist and every person in their support structure to appropriate authorities. These demands are not open to negotiation or discussion. The Taliban must act and act immediately. They will hand over the terrorists, or they will share in their fate.
The Taliban's response? No. So, on October 7th, 2001, the United States military initiated Operation Enduring Freedom and invaded Afghanistan.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Day 2 of the assault looked like day 1, 10 carrier-based fighters lifting off at dusk, plus all 3 types of U.S. heavy bombers, B-52s and B-1s from Diego Garcia, B-2 stealth bombers again making the trip from the U.S. to Afghanistan to drop super-accurate satellite-guided bombs, and more Tomahawk cruise missiles fired by U.S. Navy ships in the Indian Ocean. The areas around 3 Afghan cities are being struck. U.S. officials say the targets are Taliban troops, air bases, and anti-aircraft batteries, Mohammed Omar and his Taliban leadership, plus Al-Qaeda troops of Osama bin Laden.
The battle is now joined on many fronts. We will not waver, we will not tire, we will not falter, and we will not fail. Peace and freedom will prevail. Thank you. May God continue to bless America.
The legal authority for the war came from the AUMF, or the Authorization for the Use of Force 2001, a law which gave the president the authority to use all, quote, necessary and appropriate force against those who did the attacks and those who aided people who did the attacks. The law passed overwhelmingly. The only person in the United States Congress to vote no was California Representative Barbara Lee. She voted no because she saw the bill as way too broad, way too vague, and gave the president too much unchecked power, saying that it could lead to, quote, an open-ended war with neither an exit strategy nor a focused target.
I rise today really with a very heavy heart, one that is filled with sorrow for the families and the loved ones who were killed and injured this week. This unspeakable act on the United States has really forced me, however, to rely on my moral compass, my conscience, and my God for direction. Yet I am convinced that military action will not prevent further acts of international terrorism against the United States. Some of us must urge the use of restraint. Some of us must say, let's step back for a moment. Let's just pause just for a minute and think through the implications of our actions today so that this does not spiral out of control. As a member of the clergy so eloquently said, as we act, let us not become the evil that we deplore. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired.
She would receive enormous backlash, including death threats for her opposition to this bill. Nevertheless, the AUMF became law, and the war was in full swing. At first, the war was very popular. 2 days after 9/11, a Washington Post ABC poll found that 93% of Americans supported military action, and 86% were even willing to go to war. Bush's personal approval rating was also sky high at a whopping 90% in the days following 9/11. That's insane. These days, the best a president can hope for is getting into the high 50s. The US and a bunch of its allies swept through Afghanistan, taking the capital of Kabul and then Kandahar, and the Taliban fell from power. But they would not disintegrate. Instead, they retreated to the country's rural areas, where they would remain for 2 decades, causing trouble and making gains where they can. The US installed Hamid Karzai to be the leader of a temporary government in Afghanistan. That December, the US got really close to capturing bin Laden at the Battle of Tora Bora, where they almost got him in the cave complex. But he escaped, and the US would never come close to capturing bin Laden for a decade. But still, the regime successfully changed. This was a victory, and the US and other countries would now focus on reconstruction and nation building in Afghanistan. Now, of course, as we all know, Afghanistan will go on to be the longest war in American history, and seen today as a modern-day Vietnam. But right now, at this point, things were going well, and that meant that the war on terror was going well. But remember that this was a global war on terror, and ever since Wolfowitz detailed his plan of attack, there was a certain country that was nibbling on the back of George W. Bush's neck: Iraq. On September 26th, Bush told his Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, to look into America's military plans regarding Iraq. At first, it seemed that he was just covering his bases. You know, checking all of our enemies to make sure that we don't get attacked again. But what's interesting to note is that Bush never asked his administration to look into possible involvement of other US enemies like Libya or North Korea in the 9/11 attacks. He never asked about our military plans against Iran, a country which, as previously explained, is a sworn enemy of the United States. It seemed that Iraq stood alone as the big bad in Bush's mind. And then, anthrax.
Florida man has contracted a very rare and potentially deadly form of anthrax.
Rare inhaled form of anthrax. Health and Human Services Secretary Tommy Thompson calls it an isolated case.
So, after 9/11, there was a fear that there would be a second wave of attacks. In the weeks following 9/11, a bunch of letters laced with anthrax were sent to the letterboxes of numerous powerful senators, representatives, news organizations, and other prominent figures. In these attacks, 5 people died and over a dozen fell ill. This scared the crap out of people. Bush speculated that this could be the second wave of attacks. He also speculated that these attacks could have been done by Iraq. Now, it was later found out that this had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and was a domestic attack, but the point is that it scared people, and this Guardian News article blamed it on Iraq. In fact, a lot of politicians suggested that it could be from Iraq, further antagonizing the country in the eyes of the American public. On November 21st, Bush straight up asked Rumsfeld, "What have you got in terms of our plans for Iraq? What's the status of our war plan? I want you to get on it, and I want you to keep it a secret." Starting in December, Dick Cheney ordered Rumsfeld to have meetings with General Tommy Franks about creating new war plans in Iraq. Then came 2002. In January, the director of the CIA, George Tenet, received custody of al-Qaeda trainer Ibn al-Sheikh al-Libi, who was captured in Pakistan and then eventually moved to Cairo by the CIA. The CIA then gave al-Libi to Egyptian interrogators, who, by using the ingenious interrogation tactic of torture, got al-Libi to talk. He told the story that he heard that 2 al-Qaeda recruits had been sent to Iraq to be trained on how to build chemical and biological weapons. Wow, a pretty strong connection between Iraq and al-Qaeda. This actually makes a great case for intervention. If only it was true. You see, al-Libi made the whole thing up. Usually what happens when you torture someone is that they won't really provide you with the correct information, more so information that the interrogators want to hear. You know, so they'll stop being tortured. Many intelligence officials thought that the story was highly suspicious, but the Bush administration ran with it and added it to the list of reasons to go to war. The CIA didn't renounce the finding until after the war had started. Shortly after this event, the U.S. opened up Guantanamo Bay, which is a detention camp on a U.S. naval base in Cuba. It was there that the U.S. would detain its most dangerous terrorists and villains. Cheney called these detainees, quote, The worst of a very bad lot. They are very dangerous. They are devoted to killing millions of Americans. By the way, if you're wondering why they call them detainees and not prisoners, it's because, well, if you call them prisoners, then you have to follow the Geneva Conventions. Footage of the first 20 detainees shows them being brought in shackles and getting down on their knees. Europe was disgusted by it, crying out torture. But several officials continued to say that these people were the worst of the worst. Now, if you're asking how any of this is legal under US law, well, you see, Guantanamo is part of Cuba, but at the end of the Spanish-American War, part of the deal for the withdrawal of US troops was that the US got to keep Guantanamo on a perpetual lease that only America could cancel. So yeah, America pays about $4,000 in rent to Cuba every year. There's actually an interview with Fidel Castro where he shows the checks, but he says he refuses to cash them.
En esta gaveta tengo algunos de ellos. Hace tiempo que no los veo.
You mean these are the checks? You mean these are the checks from the American government?
Sí, estos son cheques del gobierno norteamericano. Sí, por Guantánamo.
Tresorio General de la República de Cuba.
Quiero ver la cantidad de dinero. Estos cheques yo nunca los he manejado.
Is that every month or every...
¿Era mensual o...?
Yo creo que esto es anual.
I think it is every year.
$85.
It's $4,085.
Además, esta base no tiene ninguna utilidad militar.
The State Department was told to look for the, quote, legal equivalent of outer space, where no laws applied. Now, the reason they wanted this is because, well, the US government does torture too. Oh wait, sorry, we don't call it torture, we call it enhanced interrogation. Whether it was waterboarding, which is meant to simulate drowning, or putting people in stress positions, or a tiny box, or sleep deprivation, or walling. You know, the usual interrogation methods. The Eighth Amendment doesn't apply here, so we can do it. By the way, remember when they said that these people were the worst of the worst? Well, that wasn't actually true. You see, the US just put out a bunch of flyers in Pakistan and Afghanistan offering huge bounties for, quote, suspicious people. And a lot of these suspicious people were just poor farmers handed over by other rival poor farmers and then detained without charges or a trial. Only 8% of the inmates were thought to be part of Al-Qaeda. And again, a lot of these tortures resulted in detainees just making stuff up to stop being in pain, and it led to a lot of faulty intelligence. Guantanamo Bay is still open, by the way. Anyways, back to Iraq. This next thing is big.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
On January 19th, 2002, George W. Bush gave his annual State of the Union address to Congress in which he gave the American people an update to the War on Terror.
Fellow citizens, as we gather tonight, our nation is at war, our economy is in recession, and the civilized world faces unprecedented dangers. Yet the state of our union has never been stronger.
He talked about some of America's enemies and how they pose a threat.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction while starving its citizens. Iran aggressively pursues these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people's hope for freedom.
Hold on, pause for a second. Notice how Bush gave one sentence each to both North Korea and Iran. Now he's about to talk about Iraq, and notice how much longer comparatively he talks about this country compared to the other two.
Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its own citizens, leaving the bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world.
And then the infamous line,
states like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Axis of evil. The line garnered headlines. That word, Axis, it reminds people of the Nazis during World War II, and that was intentional. David Frum, a Bush speechwriter who came up with that line, said that he was asked by the head speechwriter of the White House, Michael Gerson, "Can you sum up in a sentence or two our best case for going after Iraq?" Frum originally came up with the line, "axis of hatred," but he later changed the word hatred to the word evil, and it became famous. Frum would later say about Gerson's ask, "His request to me could not have been simpler. I was to provide a justification for war." After this speech, it was clear what the Bush administration was trying to do. A war with Iraq would now be sold publicly. First, the Bush administration would need a reason to invade. You know, because America's a democracy. You can't just go in willy-nilly without talking to your people. You gotta make a case first. And by the way, America wasn't the only country trying to make this case. There was also the UK and its Labour Party Prime Minister, Tony Blair. Bush and Blair were good friends, and Blair was happy to go along with Bush's Iraq War, saying, "I'm with you, whatever." The only thing was that Blair was set on going through the United Nations and trying to get an international legal justification for the war. This contrasted with Dick Cheney's view. He didn't like the UN, and he thought the president had all the legal authority he needed given the supposed threat posed by Iraq. But his objections were ignored, so US and UK intelligence agencies would now try and focus on a way to make a legal argument to invade Iraq. On November 27, 2001, a memo of a meeting between Rumsfeld and General Tommy Franks detailed a war plan to invade Iraq. In the section called, "How Start?" the memo gave 3 reasons to justify war. 1. Saddam goes after the Kurds in the north. 2. There's a connection found between Iraq and 9/11. Or 3. Dispute over WMDs. Well, Saddam didn't go after the Kurds, and the idea that there was a connection between 9/11 and Iraq was being refuted. So the Bush administration chose the third one. They argued that Saddam Hussein has or is trying to develop chemical, biological, and even nuclear weapons, and that these weapons could be used to attack America. Now, I know what you're thinking. Wait, but didn't Iraq get rid of its weapons when the UN made them after the Gulf War? Yes, but the Bush administration still claimed they had them. Now, this might come as a surprise. You might be thinking, wait, hold on. Aren't you supposed to, discover that a country is acting maliciously, then make a case for war? Not decide you want to go to war first, and then start throwing around accusations to justify it? Well, yes, but as you shall see, the Bush administration just wanted to go to war and then made up a fake reason for it. Kinda like Prince Humperdinck.
Clearly, this was all planned by warriors of Gilda. We must all be ready for whatever lies ahead. Once Gilda is blamed, the nation will be truly outraged. They'll demand we go to war.
Take a look at this now declassified national intelligence estimate on the Iraqi threat from 2002. Notice the language they use. Iraq could make a nuclear weapon. Iraq may have tested BW agents. Iraq could buy a TD-2 from North Korea. It could have a launch capability with 12 to 18 months. Iraq could flight test a single-state missile. It goes on and on and on. The agencies had no physical evidence that Iraq actually had chemical weapons, but what they did have were photographs taken by satellites of so-called decontamination trucks going in and out of the Al-Musaib chemical plant. Some analysts were like, aha! They must have chemical weapons. If they didn't, then why would they need decontamination trucks there in case if anything goes wrong? The more boring explanation that other officials gave was that those were just water trucks, there to deal with any possible problem with regular explosives, but not WMDs. There was also this claim that Niger's government offered to give Iraq uranium, but this was also quickly debunked. Publicly, however, Cheney would keep pushing the war, straight up saying that there was, quote, no doubt Saddam was armed.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use them against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
This was a lie. There was doubt, but it further swayed public opinion towards going to war. In an interview with Wolf Blitzer, Condi Rice was asked how close she thought Saddam was to being able to launch nuclear weapons. Which, first off, is a bad question, because it basically assumes the question is a matter of when and not if. But Rice answered with, well, you'll get different answers depending on who you ask. We know he's doing this, we know he's doing that, but what she says next is crazy. She basically says, we don't want the evidence to come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
There will always be some uncertainty about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
And then there's this famous line from Donald Rumsfeld.
Reports that say that something hasn't happened are always interesting to me, because as we know, there are known knowns. There are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. But there are also unknown unknowns. The ones we don't know, we don't know.
One more thing to note on that Iraqi threat assessment. In the confidence level section of the report, they say that the intelligence community had low confidence on exactly when Saddam would use his supposed WMDs, whether or not Saddam would engage in attacks against America, and whether Saddam would share these weapons with Al-Qaeda. These three judgments were literally their entire argument for war, and all of them were listed as low confidence. And they even admitted that there was a low chance that Saddam would even give these weapons to Al-Qaeda. So this begs the question, since this has nothing to do with 9/11, why focus on Iraq? Well, because many of the neocons in the Bush administration didn't think the American people would be satisfied with the simple manhunt for bin Laden. I think Dick Cheney explained this feeling best in an interview with Bob Woodward. They, Al-Qaeda, have nothing to defend. You know, for 50 years we deterred the Soviets by threatening the utter destruction of the Soviet Union. What does bin Laden value? There's no piece of real estate. It's not like a state or a country. The notion of deterrence doesn't really apply here. There's no treaty to be negotiated. There's no arms control agreement that's going to guarantee our safety and security. The only way you can deal with them is to destroy them. As Robert Draper put it in his book, To Start a War, How the Bush Administration Took America into Iraq, quote, the desire to do more than simply pound sand had become a nationwide yearning. This was a global war on terror, and it was also kind of a personal pride thing for America, wanting to maintain our position as number one on the world stage. Iraq was an easy target, so they decided to go for it. But not everyone in Bush's cabinet was going for it. One of those not everyone's was Colin Powell. Compared to Rumsfeld, Powell was much more cautious about outright going to war. He was the only major person in the Bush administration to tell the president the cold, hard truth about invading Iraq. Powell confronted the president at a private dinner, telling him, Mr. President, if you break it, you own it. Taking Iraq and removing Saddam is the easy part. You'll be the proud owner of 25 million Iraqis in 18 fractious provinces. But keeping control of the country and setting up a new government, nation building, that's the hard part. It will consume your entire agenda. This will become your first term. What should I do? The president asked. Pause. This was probably the most important thing any administration official would tell the president in the lead up to the war. Powell could have said, don't invade Iraq. But he didn't. Instead, he said, go to the United Nations. Iraq had repeatedly violated the 1990s UN resolutions. They were the aggrieved party. But if you do so, there is a chance that Saddam will give up his weapons and become compliant. The president would have to accept a changed regime as opposed to regime change. But Bush had already spoken at length about how evil Saddam was. He wouldn't just accept a changed regime. But still, he decided to take Powell's advice. On September 12, 2002, President Bush gave a speech before the United Nations. It was confident. It was prepared. It was very much something you'd expect a president to deliver.
Yesterday, we remembered the innocent lives taken that terrible morning. Today, we turn to the urgent duty of protecting other lives without illusion and without fear.
However, it didn't seem to impress the UN. The delegates only clapped once. But Bush didn't really care much about what the UN thought about his speech. And as we shall see, he didn't care much about what the UN thought in general. He was just there to establish that he would go through a process and try to get the UN to pass another resolution to put back weapons inspectors in Iraq, just like Tony Blair wanted him to. This contrasted with Dick Cheney, who thought it was unnecessary.
You don't need to waste time going through Congress. The president is able to do all of this by himself. I'm a small government conservative.
But Bush didn't just want to go through the proper channels internationally, he also wanted to go through them domestically. Basically, he wanted Congress to give him the go-ahead on invading Iraq. As mentioned before, Congress already gave Bush permission to invade Afghanistan pretty unanimously, but Iraq would be way harder. He still had a pretty high approval rating at the time, within the 60s, but the American people wanted Bush to focus on the economy. But the president was determined to get authorization as quickly as possible, because he wanted to avoid what I like to call the Russia problem. If you took middle school history, you'll know that you should never invade Russia in the winter. Napoleon tried it, Hitler tried it, others tried it, I assume. Middle school history isn't that comprehensive. The Mongols tried it, and they succeeded, but that's just because they're Mongols. The point is that the problem is the weather. The cold, dark, miserable Russian winter wreaked havoc upon unprepared invading armies. This, combined with scorched earth tactics, would cause them to fall back and retreat. And this rule applied to Iraq as well, but for the opposite season. If you try to invade Iraq in the summer, it's too hot. So you either invade in the summer and have your troops die of heat stroke, or wait a whole nother half year for the weather to be suitable again. But by then you'd lose all of your political momentum for starting the war. By now it was September 2002. For an invasion to happen, Congress would need to authorize this right now. Several Congress people were skeptical of war, like Dianne Feinstein, who had concluded from various intelligence briefings that Saddam was nowhere near creating a nuclear weapon, and thus not an imminent threat. Therefore, invasion was unnecessary. The White House got Rumsfeld to give a group of 70 senators a classified Iraq briefing that didn't provide any new information and was basically just him going, known unknowns, known unknowns, known unknowns. The senators were not impressed by his performance. Neither was the White House legislative team. Never do that again. Bush kept pushing for war in his speeches. It actually got to the point where by September 2002, he was actually talking more about Saddam than bin Laden. And this had an effect on public opinion, because several polls showed that a majority of Americans thought that Saddam was responsible for 9/11. Bush didn't even explicitly say that. He just kept talking about how bad Saddam was, and a lot of Americans just put the two and two together, even though, again, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Democratic Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle told Bush, "Can we please wait until after the midterms in November to vote on this? That's what your dad did with Kuwait." No, that was reactive. This is proactive. We must take quick, decisive action. Why? Because we have to take quick, decisive action. You sure it has nothing to do with the weather? No! A lot of Democrats in Congress thought that this bill was being forced down their throats. Among these groups of Democrats were John Edwards, John Kerry, Richard Gephardt, and Bob Graham. All of these men were thinking of running for president one day, and they did not want to be on the wrong side of a potentially popular war. I mean, back in the 90s, most Senate Democrats voted against the Gulf War, because they thought they'd be signing up for another Vietnam. But the Gulf War was a huge success, and they had to live with that for the rest of their political career. I mean, look at what happened to Barbara Lee. Being framed as a traitor for not supporting the troops will kill a presidential campaign. So, a lot of them, mainly the ones seeking higher office, decided to work with the president. Carl Levin, on the other hand, who wasn't seeking higher office and was skeptical of war, drafted a resolution that would make the president show that Iraq was an imminent threat, which was the standard under international law for using force against another country. It would also require the president to go to the UN for authorization first, and if the UN said no, the president could then go to Congress to act alone. This resolution garnered a lot of support, not from wannabe presidents, of course, but it ultimately went nowhere. Bush said no. I don't want to get a resolution that ties my hands. Eventually, however, a bipartisan group of congressional leaders finally agreed on a resolution. It was a surprise announcement that threw a lot of Congress people off guard, and it was titled the 2002 Authorization for the Use of Military Force Against Iraq. It gave Bush everything he wanted. It was a blank check. The resolution itself isn't that long, about 6 pages, which is pretty normal since this is technically a resolution and not a fully fledged law. It's basically just a statement of an opinion, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have any power. The most important part of the resolution is Section 3, Authorization of the United States Armed Forces, specifically this bit right here.
Authorization. The President is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he determines to be necessary and appropriate in order to 1. Defend the national security of the United States against the continuing threat posed by Iraq, and 2. Enforce all relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions regarding Iraq.
As he determines to be necessary and appropriate. That's incredibly vague. It essentially gives the president the power to start a war with Iraq whenever he wants. Congress doesn't have the final say. He does. He doesn't even have to go through the UN. All the resolution says is that he has the power to enforce UN resolutions. And now it was up to the rest of the members of Congress as to whether or not this would get passed. One of those members was this guy, Joe Biden. Ever since the 1970s, he's been serving as a humble U.S. senator from the small state of Delaware. He voted against the Gulf War in the 90s, and since then, he always regretted it. He didn't want to oppose a potentially popular war ever again. So in 2002, he actually proposed his own resolution regarding Iraq. But the president rejected it and went with the one that gave him much more power. Biden was totally shocked at the announcement of a deal and felt kind of betrayed by his fellow Democrats. However, one thing you gotta know about Biden is that he really wanted to be president. He ran in 1988, but that failed, and he was thinking of trying again. So he decided to give the president the benefit of the doubt and announced that he would support the resolution. He told himself that it could actually decrease the chance of war because it could be used as leverage to get Saddam to work with weapons inspectors. Then there was North Carolina Senator John Edwards, who did not need any convincing. He was also thinking of running for president, and he was totally on board with taking out Saddam. And then there was this woman, who needs no introduction. But I'll give her one anyways because I gave Biden one. Back in the 60s and 70s, Hillary was a pro-peace hippie who rallied against the Vietnam War. But now she was elected senator for New York. She'd rebranded herself as a politician with pro-war hawkish tendencies. Her office was visited by both pro-war officials and anti-war peace groups. It was a tough decision. She felt indebted to Bush after the billions in aid sent to her state after 9/11. But she was still a Democrat and not totally on the bus of preemptive war. On October 10th, 2002, the House officially voted yes on the resolution, 296 to 133. 215 Republicans voted yes, 6 voted no. 81 Democrats voted yes, 126 Democrats voted no. Among the Democrats who voted no were Barbara Lee, unsurprisingly, John Lewis, Maxine Waters, Bernie Sanders, who was technically an independent, and Nancy Pelosi. Barbara Lee proposed her own amendment to the bill, which would require the president to go through the United Nations to disarm Iraq through peaceful methods.
The amendment urges the United States to re-engage the diplomatic process, and it stresses our government's commitment to eliminating any Iraqi weapons of mass destruction through United Nations inspections and enhanced containment. The administration's resolution forecloses alternatives to war before we have even tried to pursue them. We do not need to rush to war, and we should not rush to war. Our own intelligence agencies report that there is currently little chance of chemical and biological attack from Saddam Hussein on U.S. forces or territories. But they emphasize that an attack could become much more likely if Iraqi believes that it is about to be attacked.
But that failed, overwhelmingly. Among the Democrats who voted yes were Steny Hoyer and Adam Schiff.
Joint resolution to authorize the use of United States Armed Forces against Iraq.
Gentleman from Ohio. Hand me that, Charlie. The chair notes a disturbance in the gallery in violation of the rules of the House and directs the Sergeant of Arms to restore order. The clerk may proceed.
So it passed the House and then it was on to the Senate. The session lasted for 16 and a half hours. Many senators, Democrat and Republican, gave their case for going to war.
If they're called upon to execute the president's orders in Iraq, they will be doing so with every conceivable effort to minimize the loss of life on the behalf of our troops and minimize the loss of life of innocent civilians.
Mr. President, the reports demonstrating Iraq's violation of UN resolutions are numerous, compelling, and indisputable.
I commend President Bush for putting Iraq back on the world stage in his very forceful speech to the United Nations.
But I have searched my mind and soul and cannot escape this conclusion. Saddam Hussein, left unfettered, will at some point create such a danger to our lives that we cannot afford to let him be. In the post-9/11 world, inaction is not an option. At some point, Hussein must be defanged.
My colleague from West Virginia and Maryland, I do not believe this is a rush to war. I believe it's a march to peace and security. Because while Iraq's illegal weapons of mass destruction program does not pose an imminent threat to our national security, in my view, they will if left unfettered.
By the way, if you're wondering who that colleague from West Virginia was, it was Democratic Senator Robert Byrd, who had just delivered a passionate speech against the war.
People want us to ask questions. They want us to take a stand. They want us to take a stand against this stampede. Where are our senators today? Where are the backbones that stand up for the people? How many mothers, how many fathers will see their sons and their daughters die, possibly in a war in a foreign land? I say, my friends, I'm sorry to see this day. This is my 50th year in Congress, and I never would have thought that I'd find a Senate which would lack the backbone to stand up against this stampede, this rush to war.
Robert Byrd was also part of the Ku Klux Klan. Okay, but that aside, he was cooking.
We take an oath to support and defend that Constitution. Are we defending it here today? In the proposed use of force resolution, the White House lawyers, claim that, quote, the president has authority under the Constitution to use force in order to defend the national security interests of the United States. It says no such thing. I dare them to go to the Constitution and point out where that Constitution says what they say it says. They can't do it. They cannot do it. But I'm saying in the best of spirit, I just think we're making one horrible mistake. Remember, I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country.
Robert Byrd proposed 2 amendments. One of them would make it so the president only has the power to exercise this additional authority on things directly related to Iraq. The other would create an expiration date for the president's new powers. But both of these failed, overwhelmingly. After Byrd's speech, it was now time for Hillary Clinton to speak. She stood before the United States Senate. And did she stay to her peace-loving anti-war roots? No.
Intelligence reports show that Saddam Hussein has worked to rebuild his chemical and biological weapons stock, his missile delivery capability, and his nuclear program. He has also given aid, comfort, and sanctuary to terrorists, including al-Qaeda members, that if left unchecked, Saddam Hussein will continue to increase his capacity to wage biological and chemical warfare, and will keep trying to develop nuclear weapons. I will take the president at his word that he will try hard to pass a UN resolution and will seek to avoid war if at all possible. This is a very difficult vote. This is probably the hardest decision I've ever had to make. Any vote that might lead to war should be hard, but I cast it with conviction.
The resolution passed the Senate 77-23. 48 Republicans voted yes, 1 Republican voted no. 29 Democrats voted yes, 21 voted no.
The joint resolution is passed.
Among the Democrats who voted no were Robert Byrd, obviously, Patrick Leahy, and Dick Durbin. Among the Democrats who voted yes were current Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, and Dianne Feinstein. Guess she changed her mind. I wonder if that had anything to do with her husband's connections to the defense industry. Anyways, Bush signed the resolution on October 16th. Bush got what he wanted. He could now start a war with Iraq whenever he pleased. But many in his administration still advised him to seek UN approval. Did the UN give him approval? No. But they didn't do nothing. On November 8, 2002, the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 1441. The resolution allowed weapons inspectors back into the country, giving Saddam one last chance to hand over his alleged weapons of mass destruction. It did not, I repeat, it did not, however, give the US or any other country for that matter, the authority to use military force against Iraq if they did not comply with the resolution. At least that's what both the US ambassador to the UN and the UK ambassador to the UN said about the resolution. Iraq agreed to let weapons inspectors back into the country. The UN got incredible access and gave unannounced inspections at facilities. They did find some long-range missiles that Iraq wasn't allowed to have, which were then destroyed under inspector supervision, but they found no evidence of a stockpile or production of chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. The US and UK, however, accused Iraq of not fully complying with the resolution and that they were hiding something. But not every country agreed with this conclusion, like France and Germany, who thought Iraq was cooperating just fine. In December 2002, John McLaughlin, the deputy CIA director, stood by a flip chart in the Oval Office in front of Cheney, Rice, the president, and other advisors. "This is just a rough draft," he said. He then spent the next 20 minutes giving his best possible case for an invasion in Iraq. He talked about mobile weapons facilities, radio messages between Iraqi generals, UAVs, alleged chemical facilities, unaccounted for weapons, but none of it was very strong or even that persuasive. After he finished, there was silence. "Again, this is just a rough draft," he said. "Nice try," Bush said, not meaning it sarcastically. "You know, soon enough I'm going to have to ask America's fathers and mothers to send their children to fight for their country. The case needs to be stronger and more convincing. Maybe it just needs some better examples. But we're going to have to find a way to sell this to your average American." What I find very interesting about this whole situation was that Bush never went, there isn't much evidence that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction. Maybe we shouldn't go to war and spend billions of dollars and end thousands of lives. At this point, he may have pretended that he was still making up his mind about the thing, but it was abundantly clear that he was set on war. Scooter Libby, Cheney's chief of staff, created his own presentation, one with much more pizzazz, and zing, and pictures, and videos.
Iraq lobster!
Fantastic. Much better. But we need someone else to make this case. Someone everyone can trust to convince the American people and the world. Who did you have in mind? I got just the idea. On January 13th, 2003, Bush was alone with his Secretary of State, Colin Powell. Can you do this for me, Colin? A lot of people saw Colin Powell as the one sane guy in the room. The secretary had always thought that invading Iraq was a bad idea, but he never officially advised against it, and now it was too late. It was a storm he couldn't stop. The defense secretary, the deputy defense secretary, the CIA, the rest of the intelligence agencies, they had already lined up behind the president, and many were adding fuel to the fire. If Powell had told the president no, he'd have to resign. Robert Draper theorized what could have happened next after this point. His theory went something like this. If Powell resigned, it would have led to many other higher-ups in state resigning as well. Powell had a lot of friends in the British government, like Jack Straw, who would later go on to say that if Powell resigned, he would have resigned. Blair's support in the Labour Party would have tanked, he would be forced to withdraw his support for the war, an authorization vote in Parliament would have failed, the media would have thrown a huge frenzy, public opinion in the war would dip, and the momentum of the storm could have been slowed. And maybe it could have slowed just long enough for the UN inspectors to reach a full conclusion that no, Saddam had no weapons of mass destruction. Maybe the whole war could have been avoided, and all Powell had to do was resign. But he didn't resign. Powell wasn't a dissenter. He was a general. And in the end, you do what you're told. You go along for the ride. "I'll do it," he said. Powell and his aides spent the next few weeks gathering information and making a case. On February 5th, 2003, Colin Powell addressed the United Nations and the world on the Iraqi threat.
"What you will see is an accumulation of facts and disturbing patterns of behavior. The facts in Iraqis' behavior Iraq's behavior demonstrate that Saddam Hussein and his regime have made no effort to disarm as required by the international community. Indeed, the facts and Iraq's behavior show that Saddam Hussein and his regime are concealing their efforts to produce more weapons of mass destruction.
It was a 76-minute series of lies. Lie after lie after lie. He talked about the so-called decontamination trucks lie.
The truck you also see is a signature item. It's a decontamination vehicle in case something goes wrong.
He claimed that Saddam's son ordered WMDs to be removed from palace complexes. He claimed that Iraq was purchasing aluminum tubes that could be used for uranium enrichment in a nuclear weapon. But this conclusion was weak. Plenty of experts at the Department of Energy disagreed with this conclusion since the dimensions of the tubes were far from ideal for the purpose of creating nuclear weapons, and instead these tubes were likely being used for something else. Powell also just straight up fabricated evidence, mistranslating conversations between Iraqi officers, implying that they were hiding something. He talked about Iraq's alleged biological weapons program and held up a fake vial of anthrax.
A little bit about this amount. This is just about the amount of a teaspoon. Less than a teaspoonful of dry anthrax in an envelope shut down the United States Senate in the fall of 2001.
And he even claimed that Iraq had mobile weapons labs on trucks and train cars where they were building their WMDs secretly in order to avoid UN inspection. He said he got this source from a man named Rafid Ahmad Alwan al-Janabi, a chemical engineer from Iraq. His codename, Curveball. There were no pictures of these mobile weapons labs, so instead Powell produced 2003 CGI renders of them.
As these drawings based on their description show, we know what the fermenters look like. We know what the tanks, pumps, compressors, and other parts look like. We know how they fit together. We know how they work. And we know a great deal about the platforms on which they are mounted.
Turns out Curveball was a failed Iraqi chemical engineering student who escaped Germany and lied to German intelligence officials, completely making the whole thing up. The German intelligence officials thought what he was saying was super sketchy, but the US took it and ran with it. Al-Janabi later admitted that he made the whole thing up to get the US to topple Saddam. Powell would go on to regret this speech for the rest of his life, calling it, quote, painful, and a, quote, blot on his record. At the time, however, his testimony had the intended effect. Following the speech, at a Democratic Senate caucus meeting, Majority Leader Tom Daschle said that he was now, quote, really convinced that Saddam had WMDs. You may not trust Cheney, he said, but do you not trust Colin Powell? The next day, the lead article in the op-ed section of the Washington Post was a column by the most prominent anti-war liberal writer for the Post, Mary McRory. She was generally anti-war, but the headline of her op-ed was titled, quote, I'm persuaded. She specifically cited the false claim that Iraq had mobile weapons labs and compared the intelligence to the Nixon-Watergate hearings. She wrote,
I wasn't so sure about the Al-Qaeda connection, but I have heard enough to know that Saddam Hussein, with his stockpiles of nerve gas and death-dealing chemicals, is more of a menace than I had thought. I'm not ready for war yet. But Colin Powell has convinced me that it might be the only way to stop a fiend, and that if we do go, there is reason.
Again, a lot of people thought of Powell as the one sane guy in the room, so when he gave his testimony before the UN, a lot of people believed it. Support for invading Iraq at this point was in the high 50s, and it had been that way for months. Bush was weeks away from pressing the let's invade button, but he wanted a multinational coalition to help him with the war. But the weapons inspectors announced on March 7th that, guys, Iraq is actually cooperating pretty well, and there seems to be no evidence of a nuclear program. Furthermore, the inspectors are weak. Iraq is hiding something. In Bush's mind, Saddam was guilty until proven innocent. We need to go for it, Tony. Right, Mr. President, but you see, Parliament will not authorize the war unless if I get approval. We need a second resolution. Fine. Guys, who's with us? There were two main sides. The first side was headed by the US, the UK, Spain, and Poland, which all agreed to support an invasion, although only a few of these countries would actually commit troops. The other side was headed by France, Germany, and Russia, which still thought that diplomacy was the answer. France fought particularly hard with the US. French President Jacques Chirac wasn't convinced that Saddam had WMDs, and the French population was strongly opposed to war. The US responded to France's opposition by renaming French fries to freedom fries in the congressional cafeteria. Wow, great comeback. Germany's chancellor actually ran his campaign on opposing a US invasion, and so it was no surprise when he said 9. And Russia opposed it because, as we all know, Russia has morals. They would never illegally and offensively invade a sovereign country on false pretenses. That would never happen! The Americans and British needed 9 of the 15 members of the UN Security Council to approve of the resolution, but they knew that they would never get the votes, and so they never proposed it. So Blair would have to convince Parliament to authorize war without UN approval. He told Parliament that if the authorization vote failed, he would resign. While all this was happening, protests were spawning around the world in opposition to the war. On February 15, 2003, millions of people gathered in nearly 600 cities around the globe to rally against an Iraq war. It was the largest recorded protest in human history. It seemed that everywhere Bush went, he got bombarded with protesters. With this, coupled with the UN failing to give authorization, you might think that the prospect of an invasion would be over, or at the very least delayed, but you'd be wrong. Bush looked at his calendar. It was mid-March. Summer was approaching. The Russia problem. If he didn't go in now, he'd have to wait a whole nother year. By that point, all the momentum for the war would die down. He'd run out of patience. It was now or never. Bush chose now. Officials from the US, the UK, Poland, Australia, Spain, and Italy met to make preparations for war. The nations gathered their troops. Invasion was imminent. On March 17th, Bush gave Saddam one last ultimatum. A choice: leave Iraq now or be invaded.
Saddam Hussein and his sons must leave Iraq within 48 hours. Their refusal to do so will result in military conflict, commenced at a time of our choosing.
Saddam chose to be invaded. The next day, the UK House of Commons voted overwhelmingly to go to war. And the day after that, on March 19, 2003, George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office to announce the start of the biggest American foreign policy disaster of the 21st century.
My fellow citizens,